I want to dive into a defensive game plan for your fantasy playoffs. Who can you stash right now to get ahead of this and ultimately prep yourself to go nuts? There's nothing. It's one of the simplest things to do, but can be one of the most impactful. When you have that 17-point defense, the 20-pointer that goes off, you need every edge you can get when you are facing the best of the best in your fantasy playoffs. And one of the easiest ways to gain that edge is getting ahead right now on your defensive game plan. So I'm going to dive into a few different things here with you to hopefully help you craft the best option for yourself. First thing you got to ask, though, is what should we prioritize? Talent versus matchup. What is more important? And when you ask that question, especially at defense, you got to think about, okay, is this matchup worth the defense on the other side? Can they rack up sacks? Can they get turnovers? Are they the type of talent pool that can, even though they might be mediocre in the right matchup, ultimately thrive and go off? Or is it just not worth it at all? And quite conversely, what about these elite defenses? Minnesota, Denver, Pittsburgh, are they locks? Do you absolutely set and forget no matter how good they've been? If they're in a tough matchup, what do we do with a talented defense facing a really good offense? Well, look at Minnesota, and they are probably lined up the number one defense right now in points per game, and I think they're going to continue to cruise. They get Chicago in week 15, 10th most points. Seattle, 5th most points allowed, tons of sacks getting surrendered there, and particularly bad special teams. And then it's really tough to get Green Bay in your championship weeks. So maybe you need to find yourself a streamer for week 17. But ultimately, if you have Minnesota, you're just riding these guys to your championship and maybe coming up with a backup plan. I got one for you. We'll talk about for week 17 in a second. You got to feel great. Denver, meanwhile, you got Indianapolis, 14th. Fine, light it up. Then you got the Chargers, not a great matchup, 24th. I'd keep that going, though. And then Cincinnati, 21st in points allowed to defenses. Not a great matchup either, the way Joe Burrow's cooking. But by then, is Burrow still going to be the quarterback? Are they going to be resting Jamar Chase? Is T. Higgins going to be having a mysterious injury because he doesn't want to play for this team anymore? I would not rule that being a smash spot where like Jake Browning and poor weapons are playing either. So Denver, Minnesota, you're riding them. Pittsburgh, though. Philadelphia, 23rd most points. Baltimore, 32nd most points. And Kansas City, 26th most points allowed to defenses. You couldn't craft a worse 3-game slate. Again, Eagles, Ravens, and Chiefs in your fantasy playoffs. That is absolutely brutal. And of the elite defenses, and again, it went Minnesota first in points scored, Denver second in points per game, and Pittsburgh's third. I don't want to trust Pittsburgh in my fantasy defenses. That's the one of these defenses where matchups are going to outweigh the talent, and I just don't expect the Pittsburgh defense to be viable in those 3 matchups. So I would be looking elsewhere for defenses. Now, who can I look at? Well, let's look at the schedule. Who has the easiest strength of schedule among your fantasy defenses right now? The teams you want to target, Titans most points allowed, Cleveland second most points allowed, and Jameis, I know he's scoring points, but we saw it last night, 20 points the defense for the Broncos, even though they gave up 32 points. It's just a fun, just complete dump fest. Then you got the Giants, of course, at number 3 in points surrendered. Vegas has given up the 4th most points to fantasy defenses. Seattle's the 5th, especially because their special teams are so bad. And then the Patriots are the 6th. I would say those 6 teams, you have the Cowboys. You got some other teams that are kind of on the rise right now. But if you can match up with Titans, Browns, Giants, Raiders, Seahawks, or Patriots, you're in a great spot. The rub there, though, is in terms of the defenses that face those teams in the multiple times across the next 3 weeks, it's bad. The best matchups for defenses come to Cincinnati. They get the Tennessee Titans, first most points allowed, the Cleveland Browns, second most points, and then they get Denver in your championship. If you somehow made it there with Cincy as your defense, I'd be stunned. They've had negative points in 3 different games. They're 29th as a scoring defense. They have had a few booms. I'll give them that, but too risky in my opinion, even though they have the best schedule, the Cincinnati Bengals. Second best schedule, the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are 30th in scoring defense points per game right now. They get Tennessee, they get the Jets who have quit, the Raiders, and then Tennessee again. So Tennessee's this week, and then for the playoffs, it's Jets, Raiders, and Titans again. You couldn't ask for a better schedule. If this defense was even halfway decent, they would ultimately be below your fab. This team could go on a heroic run. But it's the Jags. They've been awful this year. Again, 30th in scoring defense, probably despite the good schedule, leaving them on by waiver wire, but I had to mention it. And then the third best schedule is the Atlanta Falcons, 28th in points per game as a defense, though one of the worst pass rushes we've ever seen. They get the Raiders 4th most points allowed, the Giants 3rd most points allowed, and then Washington, who you would never consider playing the Falcons against. But weeks 15 and 16, Raiders, Giants, seems intriguing. And of these three, I actually wouldn't hate going to the Falcons. They just had a 5-sack game with a turnover against the Chargers, ultimately racking up 11 fantasy points. I know the upside's very low. They've been 3 or fewer in 8 of 12 games. Very rare has the Falcons ultimately come through for you. But again, the Raiders and then the Giants, that's very solid, especially the Giants at home in week 16 there. You got to give that a strong look. I do think the Falcons are a defense that you could actually consider. But none of those three, again, the Bengals, Jacksonville Jags, or Falcons are at the top of my list. And those are the easiest schedules, but there are a few defenses that are actually okay and that you could get on your waiver wires in good spots. Not great spots. And the number one defense that I will pick up is Green Bay, 44% rostered, which might go down even further because of that matchup with the Lions. They are the 5th highest scoring defense on the season right now in fantasy points per game. And they get Seattle, 5th most points allowed to defenses, New Orleans, 12th most points allowed to defenses, and Minnesota, the 11th most points. Sam Darnold taking a lot of sacks, turning the ball over a lot. Green Bay is a set and forget. If you can get them, there's a lot of potential patchwork. You roster 2 defenses, get to the end this way that you can do. But ultimately, if you just want a nice, safe, let's get one defense that I think I can rely on for the rest of the year, Green Bay would be my number one ad right now. I think they can carry you to the title and ultimately give you like an 8 to 12 point threshold each and every week. We've seen a few 20-point spikes from them this year as well. Another defense out there in a lot of leagues that's just a very good defense. In fact, they're the 4th highest scoring defense on the year in fantasy points per game right now, yet they're only 38% rostered. That's the Los Angeles Chargers. And I see the schedule. I don't love it. Tampa Bay, 22nd in points allowed, but lost a lot of weapons, giving up a lot of sacks right now. Baker certainly could turn that thing over. I'd have zero hesitation playing the Chargers in week 15. Then you get Denver in week 16. That's a tough spot, 27th in points allowed. But then if you somehow make the championship with your Chargers there, Patriots are the guys looming there, 6th most points allowed. That seems to me like a potential 20-point spot. We've seen the Chargers have 18, 19. So they've had some really big spikes and rarely have truly just crushed you. This is a genuinely good defense. Again, 4th highest scoring defense on the year, out there in nearly 70%. It's definitely a spot where I would consider. That's the defense too. If you somehow have let's say you have the Vikings and you don't want to mess with that Green Bay matchup in week 17, but the Chargers are waiting for you, that's like the ultimate defensive pairing, I would say, is if you can go Chargers and get them the Vikings and just light it up. Now, Vikings aren't going to be out there in most leagues, but if you have them and you need that week 17 fill-in, I would bid whatever I could to get the Chargers, and then you are set at defense. That's the ultimate game plan, in my opinion. Green Bay being a close second because you just get 3 nice spots. You don't have to worry about the mixing and matching and taking up multiple roster spots. One other defense, though, that is cooking right now, and I know a lot of people seem to be mentioning them, and for good reason, only 16% rostered. That's the Arizona Cardinals. They are the 10th highest scoring defense in fantasy points per game, and they get the New England Patriots at home, 6th most points allowed. The Panthers, who somehow have become not a great matchup for defenses, 16th in points allowed, and then the Rams, 20th. So not the best of matchups, but we've seen this Cardinals team really picking it up, 12, 12, 11, and 7 points in their last 4 games. They've had a lot of sacks, too. 6, 3, 5, and 5 sacks in those 4 games as well. And that's something that just John, again, a good defensive mind. He's really coached his team to get after the passer and use his talent quite well in those situations. Plus, you pick them up now, you get Seattle in week 14. Again, the special teams crumbling, 5th most points allowed. So not only can you use them in week 14 to help you get into the playoffs, Arizona could be a team that you then ride it on out at minimum. Pick them up for Seattle this week, Patriots in week 15, and let that carry you to your next matchups. Maybe that can carry you to the last defense I want to mention, the Indianapolis Colts. 17th ranked in points per game, so not a doormat, not great, very middle of the road. And week 15, they get the Broncos. Nothing I'd want to mess with there. But then in week 16 and 17, 2 home matchups. The Titans, I guess the Giants are on the road, but you get the Titans and Giants both top 3 matchups for defenses. So no team for week 16 and 17 have better matchups, especially if you have that bye. If you're in the 1 or 2 seed and you just want a defense to lock in for week 16 and 17, you couldn't do much better than the Indianapolis Colts in terms of matchups. Again, Titans, Giants, 2 top 3 matchups in the semis and then the finals. It's still tough to trust a defense that's pretty mediocre, but they have a ton to play for here, the Colts. They could still make the playoffs, and so you know they're going to be going balls to the wall. They're returning more and more defensive talent as the year has gone on, and so I really, really like stashing this team. And again, you could play like the Cardinals and the Colts, and ultimately you have the week 15 with the Cardinals, week 16, 17 with the Colts type of situation. So those are some defenses, again, to pair up. You kind of heard the matchups there. I guess the simplest plan would, again, be the Packers because you just got 3 solid enough matchups for a defense that's 4th in terms of fantasy points per game here. And they're out there, again, in well over half of leagues. So that would be my number 1 choice, the simplest way. But I do love, again, if you got to rotate some things around, some ways you could potentially do that to get to the Colts, for example. Well, the Ravens, 70% roster, but they're on bye this week. You see them getting dropped a ton because they're only the 24th defense in fantasy points per game, but they get the Giants in week 15. So if they get dropped, I love picking up the Ravens. I also have seen the Buffalo Bills on a ton of waiver wires, especially on Sleeper. They're only 50% rostered because they were facing the 49ers. Everybody worried about that matchup. Well, you look at that playoff schedule, they get the Lions in week 15. So if they get dropped, another reason to pick them up, because in week 16, they get the Patriots, and in week 17, they get the Jets. Both of those matchups will come at home. Both of those are top 12 matchups, and especially the Jets crumbling at this time of the year. I would love to have the Bills for week 16 and 17. That's another one. If you are going to be on a bye and you do not need week 15, you should be doing everything you can to get yourself the Buffalo Bills. And even if not, pairing them with the Cardinals for that again, Patriots. Yeah, the Patriots back-to-back weeks, Patriots. Or maybe, again, the Ravens get dropped, and they're sitting out there for you. So those, again, it's one of those weird years. Usually there's a defense that has like a solid defense that gets these beautiful matchups. Really the only one I see that being is the Green Bay, and it's not beautiful matchups. The beautiful matchups, again, go to the Jacksonville Jags, the Bengals, and the Falcons. None of those 3, all 3 of them, 28th, 29th, and 30th in terms of fantasy points per game. So it's not a great year for trying to play the best of the best matchups, but it's a good year if you want to pick and choose, get the Chargers for week 17, get the Bills for week 16, get the Cardinals for week 15. I wouldn't roster more than 2, maximum 3 defenses, depending on how deep your benches are. But ultimately, 2 defenses, pair the Colts and the Cardinals, or pair the Chargers and the Packers, something of that nature. Especially if you have the Vikings, you want to get a good defense for week 17. You got a bunch of options here. As Chargers being my favorite, but again, the Colts being a great week 17 option as well. What is up, you fantasy wolf? Thanks so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, share your thoughts in the comments, check out some more videos, and join the newest Wolfpack by subscribing below.